Mia felt the familiar ache of absence as she moved through the small, dimly lit storage room that held boxes of Christopher's belongings. It had been a year since he was gone, and yet every day felt freshly empty. Friends and family encouraged her to move on, but Mia hadn't been able to release her hold on the memories, the silent pieces of him that lingered in each of these boxes, unopened since his passing. Today, though, was different. She'd woken up with a strange resolve, an urge to confront whatever might still lie hidden among his things. With a steadying breath, she opened the first box, and her eyes fell on familiar items. A worn leather wallet, an old watch, postcards from their early days together. Each piece of his life seemed to hold a memory, yet none offered the closure she craved. It was as though he still had something left unsaid, something hanging between them. At the bottom of the second box, tucked beneath a few folded shirts, she spotted an old notebook with a worn blue cover. Mia's heart skipped. She recognized it instantly. It was Christopher's journal, the one she had seen him scribble in but had never been allowed to read. He'd always been private about it, insisting that it was just a collection of thoughts. Now, with him gone, it felt like an invitation to finally see the world through his eyes. A rush of nervous anticipation surged through her. Would this journal be a comforting remembrance, or would it deepen the longing she felt each day? She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she was ready to read the words he had kept hidden. But the yearning to understand him better, to hold onto some piece of him, won over. Sitting on the floor, she opened the notebook to the first page, her fingers grazing the ink with a mixture of reverence and fear. The opening entries were simple, capturing day-to-day thoughts, quiet musings, and reflections on life, work, and love. Each line offered a glimpse of the man she knew so well, gentle, introspective, and passionate. He wrote about their shared memories and his dreams for their future, his words tinged with an optimism that brought both comfort and an ache to her chest. She smiled through tears, seeing how much he had cared for her and how deeply he'd imagined their life together. But as she read further, the entries started to shift. Christopher's thoughts grew heavier, laced with a tension that Mia hadn't noticed before. He began mentioning a chapter of his life she hadn't known existed, calling it the past, as if referring to an old wound. He never named specifics, only hinted at regrets and a person he had hurt. There was a somber quality to his words, a remorse she couldn't quite place. A chill crept through her as the words grew darker. Had Christopher kept something hidden, even from her? Mia couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled over her as she read on, each entry deepening the sense of mystery surrounding Christopher's past. She flipped the pages slowly, hesitating with every turn, feeling as though she were trespassing into a part of him he'd never intended to reveal. The entries that followed painted a side of Christopher she hadn't fully known, a side that was vulnerable, even haunted. He wrote about sleepless nights filled with what he called old ghosts, the weight of past mistakes pressing on him. His words were tinged with guilt and shame, as if he were confessing silently to a sin he could never undo. Then came the first mention of someone, unnamed, yet spoken of with a tenderness and regret that made Mia's breath catch. Christopher described the person I let down the most, someone he felt he had failed but who had remained silently present in his thoughts. His words were cryptic but unmistakably heavy, laced with a sadness that Mia felt as though it had been left directly on her heart. She remembered how Christopher would sometimes withdraw into himself, a fleeting look of sadness crossing his face when he thought no one was watching. She'd assumed he was simply introspective, perhaps carrying the everyday worries of work or life. Now, she was beginning to wonder if his silences had been hiding something deeper, a secret wound he'd been carrying alone. Her hands trembled as she continued reading, her heart pounding with an inexplicable urgency. She had to know who this person was and why they had haunted him so. The pages held tantalizing hints, but never enough detail to answer her questions. Every line felt like a piece of a puzzle she was desperate to complete. Yet the more she read, the less she felt she understood. There was one entry that stopped her cold. Christopher had written, "It was my choice, and I'll live with it. But sometimes I wonder what kind of life she's had, whether she hates me, or if she even knows I exist." The confession was cryptic, but it hit Mia like a shockwave. Was he speaking of someone he'd known before her? A past lover, perhaps? Or, as the words began to echo in her mind, could it be a child? Her throat tightened, and she closed the journal for a moment, her mind racing. She wanted to believe she had known everything about Christopher. But now, it was as if the man she loved was slipping further from her grasp, piece by piece, hidden behind a veil of secrets he'd taken to his grave. Mia's hands were still trembling as she opened the journal again, unable to resist the pull of Christopher's words. Her heart raced with a tangled mix of anger, sorrow, and hope as she continued reading, knowing that each line might bring her closer to a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The next few entries were different, more fragmented, as if Christopher had been hesitant, pausing and revising before letting his thoughts spill onto the page. He wrote about a figure from his past with greater frequency now, referring to them not by name but as her. The language was painfully raw, punctuated with moments of intense remorse. Christopher recounted a pivotal moment when he had made a choice he couldn't take back, a decision he described as both a sacrifice and a betrayal. The entry that followed held words she would never forget. "I went to meet her, hoping I could do something to make things right," he had written. "But I could see in her eyes that the damage was already done. I saw the pain I'd caused, the hurt I'd left behind. I can only hope that someday she'll find it in her heart to forgive me." Mia's mind reeled as she tried to process the weight of his words. A meeting? With whom? The phrasing felt too formal, too restrained, as though he were describing an encounter he dreaded. And yet, beneath his remorse, she detected a strange tenderness, a protective instinct she'd never seen in him before. This wasn't the typical regret of a man over an old lover. It was something far more complicated, something rooted in duty and heartbreak. As she continued reading, another line leapt off the page. "If only I could be the father she deserved." Mia's breath caught. The word echoed in her mind, sending chills down her spine. Father. The suspicion that had been gnawing at her for the last few entries now felt like a solid truth crashing over her. Christopher had a daughter, a child he'd never told her about, a part of his life he'd carefully kept sealed away. And yet, he had clearly struggled with the weight of that secrecy, torn between his love for her and the silent loyalty to someone else entirely. A wave of shock rolled over her, mingling with a pang of sorrow. Her mind raced with questions. Who was this girl? Why had Christopher kept her hidden? What had kept him from sharing this monumental part of his life with her, especially if he tried at some point to make amends? Overwhelmed, Mia set the journal down, her heart pounding as she grappled with the truth. Everything felt surreal, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. For all the closeness they had shared, Christopher had died carrying a secret. A daughter, somewhere out there, whom he had loved in his own painful, conflicted way. Mia sat in stunned silence, staring at the journal as though it were a relic from another world. Christopher's final confession, his daughter, had shattered the foundation of everything she thought she knew about him. The words she had just read looped through her mind, filling her with an ache she couldn't name. Christopher, the man she had loved, had carried this monumental secret without a word, a truth so deeply concealed that she felt as though she'd never truly known him. Summoning her courage, Mia turned to the last pages of the journal, her heart pounding as she clung to the hope that these entries would explain why he had kept his daughter hidden. She needed to understand, even if it meant unraveling the love she still felt for him. In the final entries, Christopher's handwriting grew shaky, his words filled with guilt and sorrow. He described the day he had finally met his daughter. It had been years since he'd last seen her, a brief encounter clouded by silence and awkward glances. She had been just a child then, and he had made the painful choice to stay away, believing he could do more harm than good by being part of her life. His heart ached, but he was convinced that absence was the greatest kindness he could offer. But as she grew older, the weight of his decision began to suffocate him. He felt the tug of fatherhood and the unfulfilled duty gnawing at his conscience, knowing that he had denied both her and himself the relationship they deserved. In those last pages, He admitted his struggle to Mia in the form of an apology. "If you're reading this, Mia, know that I never meant to deceive you. My silence was an act of cowardice, of wanting you to see me only as the man who loved you, and not as the man who walked away from his own child." Mia's heart broke as she read those words, realizing the depth of his pain. She could feel his turmoil through the ink, his deep regret over the years of lost time. His love for her, it seemed, had been a part of his reason for keeping the secret. He hadn't wanted her to share in his shame, to view him as a man marked by mistakes. His final entry was painfully honest. He admitted that his daughter was now a young woman, old enough to remember his absence and to resent him for it. He wrote of a recent meeting, a chance encounter where he had tried, perhaps too late, to reach out. It had been awkward and strained, and though she hadn't pushed him away, he could see the hurt in her eyes. "I wish I could go back and undo it all," he had written. "But I can only hope she finds forgiveness, even if I don't deserve it." The words lingered in the air, a testament to the love and regret that had marked his life. Mia closed the journal slowly, feeling her heart split between sorrow and understanding. The man she had loved was both the Christopher she knew and a stranger burdened by a past she hadn't been allowed to see. And yet, in his vulnerability, in his final plea for understanding, she felt an inexplicable connection to him. A love that extended beyond his flaws, his regrets, and his secrets. For the first time since his passing, Mia felt as though she were seeing Christopher wholly. His scars, his missteps, and the love he'd carried for both her and the daughter he'd left behind. Mia spent the next few days in a haze, her mind trapped between memories of Christopher and the heartbreaking revelations from his journal. She found herself obsessively replaying his words, trying to imagine the young woman he had left behind and the reasons that had compelled him to keep such a life-altering truth from her. The weight of the secret bore down on her, filling her with questions she couldn't ignore. She knew there was only one way to find closure. She had to find his daughter. Driven by a mixture of grief, anger, and an unexpected sense of duty, Mia decided to piece together the fragments of Christopher's past. She gathered the few clues she had from his journal entries, focusing on the last, fateful encounter he had described. She knew the name of the town and a few sparse details about the mother, but beyond that, she was venturing into unfamiliar territory. The first lead came from Christopher's old friends, people she'd met only briefly during their relationship. Mia reached out to them, subtly probing, hoping to uncover any mention of his daughter. At first, her questions were met with silence, some reluctant hesitations, and vague references to Christopher's past. But one of his closest friends finally relented and shared that Christopher had indeed struggled with a decision years ago. A decision about stepping away from someone who meant everything to him. This friend didn't know much, only that Christopher had once mentioned a daughter, spoken of in fragments and whispers, like an unfinished chapter he couldn't bear to revisit. Encouraged by this confirmation, Mia pressed on, feeling both closer to the truth and increasingly unprepared for what she might find. She tracked down the last place Christopher had visited before his death, a small town on the outskirts of the city. The journey there felt surreal, as if she were retracing his steps in hopes of glimpsing the shadows of his hidden life. When she arrived, she was filled with an almost overpowering nervousness. What would she say? What if his daughter wanted nothing to do with him or with her? Yet, her resolve remained strong. She had come too far to turn back. Following Christopher's words from the journal, she found herself in front of a modest, weathered house. Taking a steadying breath, she knocked on the door, her heart racing. An older woman answered, her expression cautious but kind, as if she sensed the significance of Mia's visit. Mia introduced herself softly, explaining that she had been close to Christopher and was looking for answers about his past. To her relief, the woman's expression softened at his name. She motioned for Mia to come in, and as they settled into the living room, Mia felt her own walls crumble. She shared her story, her love for Christopher, the discovery of his journal, and her burning need to understand his connection to the daughter he had never spoken of. The woman listened, her face a blend of sadness and understanding. Finally, she nodded and shared that yes, Christopher had a daughter, a young woman named Emily, who was indeed his but who had grown up without him. She spoke of Emily's early years, marked by an unspoken void where a father's presence should have been. The next morning, Mia returned to the modest house with a heart both heavy and hopeful. She had spent the night wrestling with emotions that felt like a tidal wave: sympathy, longing, and even guilt for the life Christopher's daughter had lived without him. Yet beneath all these feelings lay a fierce determination to meet Emily, to finally confront the part of Christopher she'd never known. The woman who had welcomed her the day before, Emily's mother, met Mia at the door with a knowing look. She offered Mia a comforting smile, her expression softening as she led her to a nearby park where Emily often went to clear her mind. "She knows you're coming," she assured Mia, sensing her nervousness. "I told her a little about you, and she agreed to meet." Mia's heart pounded as she walked across the park, her eyes scanning the benches and pathways until they landed on a young woman sitting alone beneath a sprawling oak tree. Even from a distance, Mia could see the resemblance. Emily had the same dark hair, the same pensive gaze that Christopher had often worn when lost in thought. The sight took her breath away, filling her with an unexpected tenderness for this stranger who felt both familiar and achingly unknown. Gathering her courage, Mia approached, her steps slow and measured. Emily looked up, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence thick with unspoken emotions. Finally, Mia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must be Emily." Emily nodded, her gaze cautious yet curious. "And you're Mia, the woman who loved my father." Mia felt a pang at the words but nodded, searching for the right way to begin. She could see the mixture of curiosity and guardedness in Emily's eyes, a look that mirrored her own conflicted feelings. "Yes, I loved him very much, and I didn't know about you. Not until after he was gone." Emily's face softened, though a trace of pain remained in her eyes. "I figured. He wasn't exactly open about his past." They sat together in a quiet, tentative silence, and then, slowly, the words began to flow. Mia shared stories of Christopher, memories she had clung to in the aftermath of his death. She spoke of his laughter, his kindness, the small moments of happiness they had shared. Emily listened intently, her expression shifting between sorrow and wonder as she glimpsed the father she had never known. In turn, Emily opened up, speaking of her childhood and the lingering questions that had always haunted her. She described growing up with a vague awareness of his absence, hearing her mother speak of him only sparingly, and wondering if he had ever thought of her. She admitted that, even when he finally reached out, she had been too guarded to let him in. "I guess I was angry. I didn't want to admit that I missed him," she said, her voice faltering. Mia reached for Emily's hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture of shared loss and understanding. They were two strangers bound by a man they had both loved and lost in different ways. In that moment, Mia felt her resentment soften, replaced by a quiet understanding of the choices Christopher had made, however flawed. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Mia and Emily remained there, sharing memories, regrets, and dreams of the man who had connected them, healing through the stories they now shared. The days after her meeting with Emily felt strangely peaceful for Mia. She had come seeking answers, perhaps some sense of closure, but what she had found was far more profound. A connection to a young woman who had been as deeply affected by Christopher's choices as she had. Each conversation with Emily helped her feel closer to him, to understand the complex, hidden parts of him she'd once longed to know. Yet, there was a lingering decision that weighed on her. Mia knew she could either keep her connection with Emily alive, weaving Christopher's memory into her future through this bond, or she could let it become a quiet chapter, a memory she would carry without reopening. Both choices seemed to honor Christopher's legacy in their own way, but she was no longer certain which path would bring her true peace. One evening, Mia found herself standing on the cliffside where she and Christopher had once spent hours watching the waves crash against the rocks, a spot where he had shared his dreams with her. She let the memories wash over her, feeling the finality of his absence but also the warmth of his presence, like a lingering echo. With a gentle exhale, she made her decision. to keep Emily in her life, not out of obligation, but out of love for both of them. She would honor Christopher's memory by embracing the family he had left behind, healing her heart by offering it to someone who shared the same love and loss. In that quiet moment, Mia felt at peace, finally free of the haunting questions that had followed her since Christopher's death. She walked away from the cliffside, ready to step into a future unburdened by secrets, yet enriched by the love she had found and chosen to carry forward. If you love this emotional story and want more captivating ones with unexpected twists, be sure to hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story drops. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. We can't wait to hear what you think. See you in the next story.